Tonight we walk into pages that were never meant to be read slowly. Tonight we open early American records not as historians, not as skeptics, but as quiet travellers moving through ink, paper and forgotten margins. And almost immediately something feels wrong. The dates line up. The signatures look official, yet the land being described feels older, heavier. As if the words themselves are resting on top of something much deeper, something already ancient when the first clerks dipped their pens. So before I tell you today's story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel to receive notifications for future clips and give me some encouragement. And as you listen, I invite you to share your location and the local time where you are right now, because this story, strangely enough, has a way of stretching across places and hours at once. Now, let's begin our journey tonight. You are standing at the edge of early America, before the United States truly became the United States, before expansion hardened into destiny. The official story tells you this land was raw, wild and largely empty, inhabited only by scattered tribes and a few struggling colonies. But as you move deeper into journals, land surveys, missionary letters and military reports, you begin to notice a quiet contradiction. These writers keep stumbling over things they do not know how to name. They describe roads that are already there, towns that feel abandoned rather than founded, earthworks so large and precise that no one claims to have built them, yet everyone agrees they exist. You feel the odd calm in their tone, as if confusion has been carefully wrapped in polite language. Why does no one ask who made these things? Why does no one seem eager to remember? You read a surveyor's note written by candlelight, his handwriting steady, almost bored, as he mentions old embankments of unknown origin. Unknown to whom, you wonder? Certainly not unknown to the land itself. The soil does not forget the hands that shaped it. The rivers do not forget the banks that guided them. And yet, in these records, memory seems to have been edited. You notice something else. Names. Place names that do not fit English, Spanish, French, or any known native language. Names that appear once or twice, then vanish in later documents, replaced by simpler labels. Fort this, creek that, county something. It feels less like discovery and more like renaming, less like birth and more like inheritance. And then, softly, almost accidentally, you encounter the word Tartary. Not as a bold headline, not as a declaration. Just a passing reference, a comparison, a distant echo. A clerk writes that certain lands feel as vast and unclaimed as Tartary. Another mentions travellers described as coming from regions once called Tartarian. The word floats there, undefined, unquestioned, like everyone already knows what it means but no longer feels comfortable explaining it. You pause here, letting the silence stretch. Tartaria. In Old World maps, it was not a fantasy, it was not a footnote, it was a vast territory stretching across Asia, sometimes shown reaching into places that modern borders refuse to acknowledge. An empire or a civilization, or perhaps something looser and stranger, a network rather than a nation. And now, somehow, its shadow appears in early American ink. How could that be? How could a land supposedly isolated and newly claimed already carry echoes of something so old, so far away? You continue reading and the pattern grows clearer. These early writers often describe the land as if it is waking up rather than being born. They speak of clearing forests not to build something new, but to reveal something buried. They find stone foundations beneath wooden ruins. They find bricks where no brickyards are recorded. They find symmetry where chaos should be. And always, always the tone remains calm. No panic, no grand questions, just documentation. As if they have been instructed, gently but firmly, to record without interpreting. You feel a strange sensation now, like being lulled by a voice that is telling you something shocking in the softest possible way. The shock is not in what is said, but in what is missing. No curiosity, no wonder, no insistence on origin. It is as if the land's previous story has been deliberately lowered to a whisper, so that a new story can speak over it. You begin to wonder, what if early America was not empty at all? What if it was already organized, already shaped, already measured? What if expansion was not about conquering wilderness, but about absorbing the remains of something that could no longer defend its own name? The records do not answer you directly. They never do. Instead, they offer hints. A road described as unnaturally straight for such terrain. A mound said to be too regular to be natural, too old to attribute. A ruin labelled simply as ancient with no further comment. Ancient compared to what? Compared to the colony? Compared to memory? You notice how often the writers defer to the idea that the natives could not have built this. That phrase appears again and again, sometimes softened, sometimes blunt. And yet no alternative builder is ever seriously proposed. The question hangs in the air, unanswered, like a breath held too long. This is where Tartaria slips back into the story, not as a claim, but as a possibility, a forgotten framework, a placeholder for something that does not fit the newer narrative. You're not told that Tartarians built America. You are simply shown a world where the official builders do not match the scale of what exists. And so you walk onward, page by page, feeling the land beneath your feet grow quieter, older and more patient. You sense that whatever came before did not vanish in fire and screams, but in paperwork, in reclassification, in sonnets. You begin to understand that forgetting can be more powerful than destruction. As your breathing slows, another thought drifts in, gentle but unsettling. If early America inherited a landscape already shaped by an unknown civilization, then what does that say about humanity's story as a whole? How many times has the world been reset, renamed, redistributed? How many empires dissolve not with collapse but with rebranding? You're not asked to believe anything yet, only to notice, only to feel the weight of these early records pressing softly against your awareness. Like a lullaby sung by the land itself, telling you that history is not a straight line but a layered dream. And as you turn the last page of this section, your eyes grow heavy. Not from boredom, but from recognition. Something old is stirring, something patient, something that has been waiting for you to read slowly enough to hear it. You continue forward without lifting your head too quickly, because these records punish haste. The faster you read, the more they look ordinary. The slower you go, the stranger they become. And now you begin to notice the names. At first they seem harmless. A ledger of land grants, a list of trading posts, a report sent eastward with neat columns and careful ink. But then your eyes linger on a few words that feels misplaced. Names that do not sound English, French, Spanish or native in any form you recognize. Names that sit there calmly, as if daring you to ask where they came from. You read them once, then again. They do not belong to the mouths that supposedly spoke them. Some are written phonetically, as if the clerk did not quite know how to spell what he was hearing. Others are copied with confidence, suggesting the name was already familiar, already accepted. A fort with a title no one explains. A district called by a word that appears nowhere else in the colonies. A river whose name is later changed without ceremony, as if embarrassed by its own past. You feel the rhythm of replacement begin to emerge. Early records are crowded with strange names. Later ones are not. Somewhere between those pages, something has been quietly erased. You pause on a particular ledger entry. It lists an interaction between settlers and local authorities. That phrase alone makes you sit up slightly, even as your body remains relaxed. Authorities? In a land that is supposed to be ungoverned? The names attached to these figures are unfamiliar, formal, and oddly consistent across multiple documents. They do not belong to tribal leadership structures described elsewhere. They do not match European ranks either. And yet the tone used when referencing them is respectful, neutral, almost cautious. Why would frontier settlers, armed and confident, speak so carefully but boldly about people who supposedly had no recognized power? You trace the handwriting with your mind, imagining the clerk's steady breath, the scratch of the quill. He does not emphasize the oddity. He does not explain. He simply records, as if explanation were unnecessary or discouraged. You begin to feel that these names were once common knowledge, requiring no footnotes. Then you notice something even stranger. Some of these names resemble words found on Old World maps, maps that predate American settlement entirely. Syllables that echo regions once labelled as Tartarian. Not exact matches, but cousins, linguistic shadows. Is it coincidence, or is it memory, softened by distance and time? You drift through missionary journals next. These are supposed to be earnest, curious texts filled with moral urgency and cultural observation. Yet even here the pattern holds. The missionaries write about communities that do not fit their expectations. They describe people who live in ordered settlements, who wear clothing not easily classified, who speak languages that resist translation. One missionary notes, almost apologetically, that some groups do not appear savage, nor wholly native, but something else now diminished. Diminished from what, you wonder? From greatness? From power? From visibility? The names of these groups are written carefully, then never mentioned again in later reports, as if the words themselves were fragile, unable to survive repetition. You begin to sense a quiet rule operating beneath the surface of these documents. Observe, but do not connect. Record, but do not speculate. Use the name once, then let it fade. And fade they do. As the years pass in the pages you are reading, the names simplify. Complex titles are shortened. Foreign sounds are smoothed into English-friendly shapes. Eventually, the old names disappear altogether, replaced by counties, townships, and property lines. Ownership replaces identity. Measurement replaces memory. You feel a soft unease settle in your chest. Not sharp enough to wake you fully, but present. What kind of civilization loses its name first? Not its buildings, not its roads, just its words. You imagine Tartaria not as a single empire with banners and capitals, but as a cultural framework, a way of organizing land, authority, and knowledge. If such a system once extended into North America, even loosely, then its collapse might not look like war. It might look like reassignment, like renaming. And suddenly, the absence of conflict in these records feels louder than any battle description. There are no great wars recorded against this unknown presence, no decisive victories, just silence. As if the transition happened through paperwork, treaties, and quiet absorption rather than conquest. You find yourself asking a gentle question, almost like a whisper meant only for yourself. If a civilization is erased without resistance, was it already weakened? Or was it never meant to be remembered at all? The names continue to haunt you. Some appear only once, like a dream fragment you forget upon waking. Others linger across a decade, then vanish abruptly. There is no explanation for their disappearance, no note saying this place no longer exists. It simply stops being named. And yet the land remains. Rivers still flow where those old names once pointed. Hills still rise where unknown titles once rested. You realize that renaming does not change the land. It changes the story told about it. And stories, when repeated often enough, begin to feel like truth. Your breathing slows further now, matching the cadence of the narrative. The shock has softened into curiosity. You are no longer startled by the idea that early America inherited something ancient. Instead, you are gently exploring what it means. Perhaps Tartaria was not a place you could point to, but a memory stretched across continents. Perhaps its people were not conquerors, but custodians, maintainers of systems later mistaken for wilderness. Perhaps the reason their names disappear is because the new story had no space for caretakers, only pioneers. You're not asked to decide. Not yet. The records do not demand belief, they only invite attention. As you close this cluster of documents, you feel the weight of unnamed things pressing softly against your awareness. You sense that the loss of names is not an accident, but a signal, a signpost pointing towards something that will soon become harder to ignore. And with that thought resting lightly in your mind, you drift onward, deeper into the maps, the roads, and the structures that still remember the names even when the paper does not. You do not notice the maps at first. They wait patiently, folded into drawers, rolled into tubes, tucked between letters and treaties. They do not announce themselves. They breathe quietly like something alive that knows it will be seen eventually. And when you finally unfold one, the room seems to grow larger. The paper is thin, the ink slightly faded, but the confidence of the lines is unmistakable. Rivers curve with intention. Mountain ranges rise in neat rhythms. Borders are drawn not as guesses, but as decisions already made. This is not the language of explorers stumbling through unknown land. This is the language of someone copying what is already known. You follow the lines slowly, letting your eyes rest where the cartographer lingered. Certain symbols repeat, small stars, triangles, circles with the marks inside them. They appear again and again, sometimes hundreds of miles apart, as if marking locations of shared importance. No legend explains them, no key is offered. The map assumes you already understand. You feel a quiet chill, not fear but recognition. These maps were not meant for you, they were meant for someone else. You notice the names again, not just strange but deliberate. Long names, layered names, names that feel older than the paper holding them. Some stretch across entire regions, suggesting not towns but systems, provinces perhaps, or zones of function. And then, in later maps drawn only decades afterward, those same regions are suddenly blank or simplified, as if complexity itself has been erased. You wonder why no one seems disturbed by this loss of detail. Why does accuracy decrease as settlement increases? Shouldn't knowledge sharpen with presence? Instead, it dulls. One map in particular holds your attention. It shows wide roads cutting through forests that, according to official timelines, should not yet have been cleared. The roads are straight, unforgivingly straight. They cross rivers without hesitation, pass through hills as if the terrain had already been negotiated and agreed upon. Who built these roads? The map does not say. It does not need to. It shows them the way a heartbeat is shown on a medical chart, assumed, fundamental, unquestioned. You compare this map to a later one. The roads are still there, but now they are labelled Old Trace, Ancient Way, or sometimes nothing at all. Eventually they vanish from the drawings entirely, even though physical evidence of them persists in journals and local memory. You feel the map breathing in your hands as if it resents being simplified. Some early American maps include notations that feel almost like apologies, phrases such as formerly called or once known as. The mapmaker acknowledges a past name, then gently moves on, as if closing a door quietly so as not to wake anyone. And then there are the borders. These borders do not follow natural features. They do not hug rivers or mountain ranges. They slice across the land in calm geometric confidence. Straight lines drawn through wilderness that supposedly had no prior divisions. You ask yourself a soft question. Who decided these lines mattered? Because someone did. Borders imply agreement. Even conflict implies recognition. A border without explanation suggests inheritance. The acceptance of someone else's order. You recall old world maps of Tartaria, how they too favoured broad regions, gentle borders, and symbolic markers over rigid national lines. You notice the similarity not in shape but in philosophy. These American maps feel less like conquest and more like continuation. You find marginal notes written by later hands, corrections, revisions, cross-outs. A mountain range is moved, a lake is reduced, a name is shortened. It feels like watching memory being edited in real time. Why remove detail? Why erase complexity? You begin to understand that maps do more than describe land. They tell stories about ownership, legitimacy, and time. And these early American maps seem to be telling two stories at once, one of discovery and one of quiet replacement. The land on the map looks settled before settlers arrive, measured before measurement, named before naming. Your breathing slows further now, syncing with the steady rhythm of the cartographer's lines. The shock of realization softens into a drifting curiosity. If these maps reflect an older knowledge system, then the people who drew them were either inheritors or imitators. You imagine Tartaria not as an invading force, but as a mapping tradition, a way of seeing land as interconnected, purposeful, and already alive with meaning. If that tradition reached America, even faintly, then what you are witnessing is not mystery but aftermath. The maps do not shout this truth. They hum it, quietly, persistently. As you fold the paper back into itself, you feel as though you are tucking away a living thing, something that would keep speaking if only allowed to remain open. You sense that the land remembers these lines, even if modern eyes no longer see them. And as you drift onward, deeper into the records, one thought settles gently into your mind, heavy but calm. Perhaps the greatest secret is not that America was empty, but that it was already mapped, and someone decided to pretend otherwise. You arrive at the fort's necks, though the word itself already feels misleading. Forts are supposed to be temporary. Wooden walls, rushed construction, a nervous response to danger. That is what the story tells you to expect, but the records do not agree. You read descriptions written by officers who are meant to be practical men trained to see usefulness, not mystery. And yet again and again they describe arriving at sites where a fort was raised upon foundations already present. Stone foundations, thick, level, old enough that moss had learned their shape. You pause, letting that settle. A fort built on ruins is not a fort, it is an occupation. Some officers note, almost casually, that rebuilding was easier than building, that walls already stood in part, that cellars were found where none should exist. One report mentions discovering drainage systems beneath a newly claimed outpost, channels cut with care, sloping just enough to carry water away without flooding. Who designs drainage for a wilderness fort? You feel the strange calm return, the same tone you have begun to recognize. No alarm, No investigation, just acceptance. As if these men had been trained not to ask certain questions, or perhaps had learned that asking them led nowhere. The forts themselves are described as oddly symmetrical. Square layouts, aligned corners, gateways facing specific directions. This is not how panic builds. This is how planning behaves. Long-term planning. Planning that assumes permanence. You notice how often these structures are labelled strategic without explanation. Strategic against whom? Native resistance is often mentioned elsewhere, but these fort locations do not always make sense for that purpose. Some are placed far from known conflict zones, yet precisely positioned near rivers, crossroads, or elevated ground with wide visibility. It feels less like defence and more like guardianship. As you drift through these accounts, you begin to sense that the forts were not choosing their locations. The locations were choosing the forts. Several documents refer to old works discovered during construction. Earth embankments, stone circles, buried walls. The language is vague, but the implication is clear. Something was here before, something organised, something deliberate. One officer writes that local natives claim the place was already ancient when their grandparents were young. Another notes that the tribes avoided certain sites altogether, treating them with quiet respect or unease. These places were not sacred in a religious sense, but in a practical one, left alone because they belonged to someone else long ago. You imagine time folding in on itself here. Tartarian presence not as an army marching in, but as an infrastructure quietly aging beneath layers of new ownership. Roads becoming trails, buildings becoming foundations, names becoming whispers. Some forts are described as impossibly large for the early population meant to occupy them. Barracks that could house hundreds where only dozens were stationed. Storehouses built to hold supplies that never arrived. Towers rising higher than needed, offering views far beyond immediate necessity. Why build so much so early? You begin to feel that these forts were not designed for the present moment, but inherited from a past that anticipated scale. A civilization that expected movement, trade, and long-distance coordination. A civilization that did not fear emptiness, because emptiness was never part of its design. You notice that later expansions often reuse these same sites. Cities grow where forts once stood. Forts stand where older structures rested. Layers upon layers, each generation claiming novelty while leaning on what already exists. And still, no one stops to ask who laid the first stone. You feel a lullaby-like rhythm take hold now. Stone, wood, paper, name, replace, repeat. The process feels mechanical, almost gentle, as if erasure itself has learned to be polite. Some records mention that the stone used in these early forts does not match local geology. It was transported, carried, moved with effort. That implies organisation, labour and time, none of which fit the official narrative of sudden settlement. And yet the contradiction is allowed to remain unresolved. You think again of Tartaria, not as a single empire with flags, but as a system of construction, a way of shaping land that prioritised alignment, durability and continuity. If such a system once extended across continents, then these forts are not anomalies, they are leftovers. You are not meant to feel alarmed by this realization. The tone of the records does not allow it. Instead, you are meant to feel calm, almost comforted. The land was not wild, it was prepared. The world was not empty, it was waiting. As your breathing deepens, you imagine the quiet hands that once placed those stones. Hands that did not expect to be remembered by name. Hands that trusted the structure itself to endure beyond language. And perhaps that is why names vanish so easily. Buildings speak longer than words. You close the file slowly, as if not to disturb what still sleeps beneath these forts. You sense that the deeper you go, the less dramatic the truth becomes, and the more inevitable. Civilizations do not always fall in fire. Sometimes they sink, gently, becoming the ground others stand upon. And as you move onward, you carry with you the soft, unsettling thought that every new fort might actually be an old one, patiently wearing a different flag. You step away from the forts and find yourself moving along lines that do not belong to walls or borders, but to movement itself. The records begin to speak of roads, though even that word feels too small for what is being described. They call them traces, great roads, ancient paths, wide ways, and almost always, the same quiet confusion follows each mention. No one knows who made them, no one claims responsibility, no one remembers a beginning. You read a traveller's journal describing a road so broad that wagons could pass each other without slowing, cutting through dense forest as if the trees had politely stepped aside. He writes that the path was cleared before we cleared it, a phrase that lingers in your mind like a riddle meant to be solved in sleep. You notice how often these roads are described as straight. Not roughly straight, not directionally straight, but precisely straight. Mile after mile, ignoring terrain, crossing rivers at narrow logical points, cresting hills where visibility opens naturally. This is not how footpaths evolve. This is how surveying thinks. You feel the same recognition you felt with the maps. Roads, like borders, imply prior knowledge. They suggest destinations that matter, trade that repeats, movement that is expected, and yet the official story insists that early America had no such networks. The contradiction is never addressed directly. Instead, the records soften it. They suggest the roads were made by natives long ago, then in the same breath admit that no tribe claims them and no oral tradition explains them. The explanation is offered, then quietly withdrawn. You sense that this is how uncomfortable truths are handled, not denied, but blurred. Some roads are called giant roads. That phrase appears more than once, always without elaboration. Giant, not in the sense of myth, but in scale. Too wide, too level, too deliberate. You imagine the effort required to build such roads without modern machinery, and the thought makes your breathing slow even further. Why would a supposedly sparse population need infrastructure on this scale? You read accounts of settlers following these roads instinctively, trusting them without knowing why. They lead to rivers, mounds, fertile valleys, and high ground. The roads seem to know where they're going. The settlers are merely guests, walking along decisions made long before their arrival. You begin to feel that the land itself is guiding movement, using these old routes as quiet suggestions. Some records mention that these roads align with the sun at certain times of year. Others note how they connect sites of ancient works with uncanny precision. Mounds to mounds, river bend to river bend, fort to fort, a network reveals itself, not loudly but persistently. You think again of Tartaria, of its reputation not just as a place but as a system of coordination across vast distances. If such a system existed, it would need roads, not random trails but arteries, channels of movement, trade and information. And if that system collapsed or withdrew, the roads would remain. Too large to erase, too useful to ignore, so they were renamed, absorbed, explained away. You notice how later documents begin to narrow these roads. They are cut into, divided, claimed, fences appear, property lines interrupt their flow. What was once public becomes private. What was once connective becomes segmented. This feels important, though no one says it is. You imagine the road as a memory, slowly overwritten by newer paths that serve a different story. The original purpose fades, but the physical trace refuses to disappear entirely. Your body relaxes as your mind wanders along one of these old roads, feeling the rhythm of footsteps layered across centuries. Traders, builders, surveyors, settlers, all using the same path, all telling themselves different stories about why it exists. You are struck by a soft, unsettling idea. Perhaps expansion did not create movement in America. Perhaps it merely stepped into movement that was already there. The records do not resist this thought. They accommodate it quietly, offering no rebuttal. As you reach the end of this section of documents, you feel the road continuing beyond the page, beyond the narrative, beyond waking thought. It stretches forward and backward in time, indifferent to who walks it. And as you drift onward, toward, you carry the gentle awareness that roads remember more than people do, and they rarely forget who laid the first stone. You leave the roads behind, though they never truly leave you. They lead you gently and without effort toward the shapes that rise from the earth itself. The records begin to speak of mounds. At first, the descriptions feel almost casual. Earthen hills, raised ground, curious formations. But as you read on, the scale becomes impossible to ignore. Vast complexes, long lines, perfect circles, squares aligned with the horizon, shapes so precise they resist the comforting excuse of nature. You feel your breath slow as the language shifts. The writers struggle here. They use words like mysterious and ancient, then quickly retreat into vagueness. They admit the mounds exist. They admit they're old. But they stop short of asking why they are here at all. Some mounds stretch for miles. Others rise in layered terraces, each level deliberate, each angle intentional. A few are shaped like animals, serpents, birds, creatures seen clearly only from above, and that realization settles over you like a quiet fog. From above. How do you design something meant to be seen from the sky, when the official builders had no way to leave the ground? The question is never written, but it hums beneath every description. You read how settlers dug into some mounds, driven by curiosity or greed. They found stone chambers, timber supports, skeletons laid with care, artifacts that did not match any known culture, copper tools, carved tablets, symbols that repeat across distant sites. The tone remains oddly restrained. No urgency, no wonder. Just documentation, as if even the discovery of buried rooms fails to break the spell of calm. Native informants are quoted sparingly. When they are, their words carry a quiet finality. They say the mounds were already old when their stories began. They say the builders are gone. They say the land remembers, but the people do not. You sense respect in those statements, not ownership, not pride, distance. The mounds are not treated as ancestral achievements, but as inherited features, like mountains or rivers, present, powerful, and not meant to be disturbed. You begin to notice alignments. Many mounds are placed near the same old roads you just followed. Others sit at river junctions or on high ground overlooking vast areas. Some align with solstices, equinoxes, and star risings. This is not random earth piling. This is planning across generations. You think again of Tartaria as a civilization of systems rather than monuments. If such a culture existed, mounds would make sense, not as graves alone, but as markers, regulators, and signals, places where land, sky, and movement intersect. You feel the story becoming heavier now, though still gentle. The mounds are harder to dismiss than names or roads. They rise above denial. They insist on being seen. And yet, you notice how quickly the narrative shifts in later records. The mounds become curiosities, then obstacles, then farmland, levelled, ploughed, forgotten. Why remove them if they are harmless? You realise that mounds disrupt the story of emptiness. They say, clearly and silently, someone was here. Someone organised this land. Someone thought in shapes too large to be accidental. As your mind drifts, you imagine these mounds not as relics of a primitive culture, but as components of a vast land management system. Earthworks designed to guide water, mark territory, and store knowledge in form rather than text. Knowledge that survives even when language is lost. You feel comforted by that idea. There is something soothing about a civilization that builds memory into the land itself, trusting soil and geometry more than paper. And perhaps that is why paper betrays it so easily. The records never deny the mounds. They simply stop talking about them. Silence, again, doing the work of erasure. As you close this section, you feel the earth beneath you as layered and patient. The mounds do not demand recognition. They wait. They have waited before. And as you drift onward, your body heavy and relaxed, you carry the soft awareness that the ground beneath early America was not blank, but written carefully in a language of earth and time. You drift northward now, though no compass is needed. The records guide you gently, pulling your attention toward water. Vast, cold, patient water. The Great Lakes appear in the documents not as borders, but as centres, and beneath their calm surfaces, another whisper begins to rise. Copper, not coinage, not trinkets, but copper on a scale that unsettles the tone of frontier simplicity. You read early reports describing veins already exposed, pits already dug, and tunnels already collapsing back into the earth. The writers seem unsure how to describe what they are seeing, so they default to understatement. Evidence of former working, one report says. Former by whom? The sentence never finishes the thought. You notice that the copper described is unusually pure, nearly free of impurities, hammered, shaped, worked without smelting in ways that suggest deep familiarity with the material. Tools are found far from any recorded settlement, yet show signs of repeated use, repair, and transport. This is not opportunistic mining. This is industry. You read that thousands of tons of copper appear to have been removed long before European arrival. Not scattered pieces, not surface gathering, but organised extraction, sustained over time. The scale makes your breathing slow, not from fear but from awe. Who needed this much copper? The official explanations feel thin. Some suggest ancient natives worked the copper, then forgot how. Others imply the numbers are exaggerated. But the physical evidence remains stubborn. Deep cuts in stone, consistent tool marks, waste piles layered with time, and again the calm tone persists. No urgency, no effort to trace the metal's destination, as if following the copper would lead somewhere inconvenient. You begin to imagine a northern network, a supply chain feeding roads, mounds, and structures far beyond the lakes. Copper for tools, for construction, for something more refined, conductive perhaps, symbolic, functional in ways no longer remembered. You think of Tartaria's rumoured technological sophistication, not in the modern sense of machines and wires, but in materials, resonance, and large-scale coordination. A civilization that understands how to shape resources quietly, efficiently, and leave little behind but scars in stone. The lakes themselves feel complicit. They cover, they preserve, they soften the edges of memory. What sank beneath them is not gone, only hidden. Some local legends slip into the records like half-dreams, stories of lights on the water, of structures glimpsed beneath clear ice, of stones laid where no stones should be. These accounts are noted, then dismissed gently, like a child's question answered with a smile. You feel the lull deepen now. The water imagery slows your thoughts, waves, depth, silence. You realize that copper does not rust like iron. It endures, it remembers shape. Perhaps that is why its story feels harder to bury, and yet, bury it they do. Later records mention the mines briefly, then not at all. Interest fades, focus shifts, expansion moves on. But the copper remains where it was worked, and so does the question. As you drifted away from the lakes, you carry with you a quiet certainty. Whatever shaped early America did not fear complexity. It embraced it, and its traces lie not only on the land but beneath it, waiting for those who listen slowly enough to hear metal dreaming in stone. You do not meet them directly, not at first. They appear in the records the way shadows appear at dusk, noticed only when something familiar feels slightly off. The writers call them travellers, visitors, strangers, and yet the language used around them is careful in a way that curiosity alone does not explain. These figures move through early American accounts wearing coats of quiet authority. They are described as well-dressed, but not European, calm, but not submissive. They speak through interpreters sometimes, yet often seem to understand more than they say. Their presence unsettles without provoking fear, and most strangely of all, they are treated with a form of respect that frontier life rarely extends to the unknown. You read a Trading Post report that mentions a group arriving from the interior, though no known settlement exists in that direction. The clerk notes their bearing, upright, composed, and remarks that negotiations were conducted smoothly, as if customs were already agreed upon. Already agreed upon by whom? Another account describes men carrying documents, papers, seals, marks of legitimacy, that no one recognizes, yet no one challenges. They are allowed passage, given supplies, sometimes even escorted. Why? You sense that these travellers are not perceived as threats, nor as curiosities. They are perceived as official, as remnants of something once acknowledged, even if no longer understood. Their names, when recorded, resist classification. They do not align with known languages. Their titles are transliterated awkwardly, sometimes replaced entirely by generic labels like envoy or agent, as if the true word felt too heavy to carry forward. You notice that these encounters become rarer as time passes. Early records mention them more often, later ones barely at all. As the frontier hardens into borders and laws, these figures seem to fade, like embers cooling beneath ash. You imagine them as custodians, keepers of an older order moving quietly through a world that no longer recognizes their authority. Perhaps they were once administrators of land, trade, or knowledge. Perhaps they belonged to a system that did not collapse overnight, but thinned, retreated, and finally dissolved into anonymity. You think again of Tartaria not as a conquering empire, but as a civilizational layer. If such a layer once extended into North America, then its people might not vanish all at once. They would linger, travel, observe, negotiate their own disappearance. The records do not dramatize this. They do not tell stories of confrontation. Instead, they present these encounters as mild inconveniences. Footnotes. Minor deviations from the expected narrative. That, you realize, is what makes them so unsettling. If these travellers were imposters, they would provoke conflict. If they were myths, they would be colourful, but they are neither. They are treated as real, functional, and gradually irrelevant. You feel a gentle sadness settle in your chest, though its rhythm remains slow and calming. There is something deeply human about a civilization fading without protest, leaving behind only manners, procedures, and half-remembered titles. As your mind drifts, you imagine these figures walking the old roads you followed earlier, stopping at mounds, checking markers, speaking softly among themselves. They know the system is ending. They do not fight it. They simply continue until there is nowhere left to go, and then they are no longer written about. You notice how the silence returns, clean and complete. No declarations of departure, no final records, just absence. As you move onward, you're breathing steady and deep. You carry the soft awareness that history does not always erase with violence. Sometimes it allows something to fade politely, like a guest who realizes the party has changed and chooses to leave without saying goodbye. You begin to notice movement again, but this time it is quieter than roads and softer than travellers. It moves through ledgers, inventories, and shipping notes. It moves without announcing itself. Trade. The records list goods appearing in places where they should not logically be. Fine textiles far from ports. Metal tools of consistent design scattered across distant regions. Ceramics that repeat patterns found hundreds of miles apart. The writers do not call this strange. They simply record it line by line as if the flow itself were expected. You feel the rhythm of exchange settle into your breathing. In, out, send, receive. The tide moves whether or not anyone understands the moon that pulls it. Some trading posts report receiving items from the interior before any formal routes are established. Others mention quantities that exceed local demand, as if the goods are passing through rather than arriving. You sense a network at work, one that predates official markets and ignores colonial boundaries. And then there are the goods with no origin. Copper-shaped in standardized forms. Cloth dyed with methods not described. Tools balanced so well they feel trained rather than crafted. No maker's marks, no signatures, only consistency. Consistency implies system. You read a merchant's complaint about prices being strangely stable despite scarcity. That should not happen in frontier economies. Scarcity breeds volatility. Yet here, something smooths the exchange, regulating it quietly. You imagine an older trade network still breathing beneath the newer one, guiding flow like an underground current. Settlers step into it unknowingly, benefiting from pathways and agreements they did not create. You think again of Tartaria as a civilizational mesh, rather than a throne-based empire. If its strength lay in coordination, then trade would be its language. Goods would move not for profit alone, but for balance. Some records hint at trade gatherings, large, orderly and calm. No chaos, no haggling frenzy. Participants arrive, exchange and leave, almost ceremonial, almost remembered. You notice how little conflict is recorded around these exchanges, that absence feels louder than any argument. Trade without friction suggests shared rules. Shared expectations. Rules require authority, even if unseen. As expansion accelerates, these patterns begin to break. Prices fluctuate, routes fragment, goods localize, the tide becomes choppy, the old smoothness disappears. You feel the lull deepen as you realize what you are witnessing is not growth, but replacement, a quieter system giving way to a louder one. And yet, for a brief window in the records, both exist at once, overlapping, interacting, uneasy but functional. As you drift onward, you carry the gentle awareness that long before markets shouted, trade whispered, and someone long ago taught the land how to listen. You lift your eyes from the ledgers and inventories, and almost without noticing how it happens, your gaze rises upward. The records do the same. They begin to speak of the sky, not in poetry, not in wonder, but in measurements. You read cabin journals where settlers note star positions with an accuracy that feels out of place. You read council notes that reference seasonal movements not just of animals, but of constellations. You read of journeys planned not merely by rivers and roads, but by the timing of certain lights overhead. This is not folk superstition. This is navigation. And yet these references appear in places where you would not expect them. Remote settlements, temporary camps, trading posts barely standing. Why would people on the edge of survival track the heavens with such care? You feel the familiar calm of contradiction return. Some records describe star charts found in unexpected hands. Not scholars, not astronomers, but traders, guides, and local leaders whose official descriptions portray them as simple or uneducated. The charts are not ornate, they are practical. Clean lines, clear markers, designed to be used, not admired. Used for what? You notice how often these charts align with the old roads and mound sites you have already encountered. Certain paths are best travelled when specific stars rise. Certain locations become important only at particular times of year. Movement, land, and sky form a quiet triangle of coordination. You begin to feel that early America was not navigated randomly. It was oriented. Some documents mention meetings scheduled according to celestial events rather than dates. When the northern star stands thus, one note says, another refers to an agreement renewed at the turning of the sky. These phrases are not explained. They are written as if everyone involved already understands. You imagine a worldview where time is not counted forward but cycled, where direction is not north alone but above and below, where the sky is not distant but participatory. You think again of Tartaria as a civilization often associated with astronomical knowledge, maps that extended beyond land, calendars tied to stars rather than kings. If such knowledge crossed into North America, it would not arrive as lectures. It would arrive as habit. Habit survives longer than belief. You feel your breathing slow even more now, as your mind drifts into the quiet rhythm of stars rising and setting. There is something deeply soothing about the idea that people once moved through the world guided by light that never belonged to anyone. The records hint that this sky knowledge fades over time. Later journals replace star references with clock time. Celestial cues give way to schedules, timetables, and standardized hours. The sky becomes background rather than guide. You sense the loss, even though the documents do not mourn it. Some settlers write of feeling disoriented when old guides disappear. Roads still exist, landmarks remain, but something subtle is missing. The sense of timing, the feeling of being in sync with something larger. You realize that losing sky knowledge does not feel dramatic. It feels like mild confusion, like waking up slightly off rhythm, and so it slips away easily. As you drift onward, your eyes heavy and calm, you carry a gentle thought with you. Perhaps the most advanced knowledge is the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that hums quietly, aligning land, movement, and time until no one remembers it was ever taught. The stars do not forget. They wait. You lower your gaze from the sky and it settles gently on stone. The records begin to mention buildings again, but not the rough cabins you expect. These are towers, spires, bell structures, masonry so refined that even the writers seem unsure how to describe it without pausing. Churches appear where no congregation yet exists. Bells arrive before towns. Towers rise in places where the population barely justifies a meeting hall. The tone remains calm, factual, almost sleepy, but the implications ripple quietly beneath the surface. You read of stonework that does not match the tools supposedly available. Blocks cut with precision. Arches balanced without explanation. Mortar that endures far longer than it should. Some writers admit briefly that the style feels old world, then quickly move on. Old world where? You notice how often these structures are said to be discovered, not built, repaired, adapted, claimed. A bell tower is said to have been standing already, though weathered. A church foundation is described as pre-existing, of unknown origin. These phrases pass without comment, like scenery glimpsed from a slow-moving carriage. You feel the same lull settle in, the sense that something is being accepted without being understood. The bells themselves feel important. Bells are not just instruments. They organize time. They call people together. They mark hours, warnings, rituals. And yet, in several records, bells exist before the social structures that would use them. Why prepare time before people? Some towers are aligned with roads and sightlines, visible from far away, almost like markers rather than sanctuaries. Others are positioned near mounds or old routes, quietly linking stone to earth, sound to movement. You begin to feel that these buildings were not meant to dominate, but to coordinate. You imagine Tartarian architecture not as ornament, but as function disguised as beauty. Structures designed to resonate, to signal, to endure. Buildings that speak in vibration rather than language. The records do not say this. They do not need to. The stone says it quietly. As expansion continues, these towers are rebranded. A church here, a courthouse there, a school bell repurposed from something older. The structure remains, but its meaning shifts. You notice how later histories credit the builders enthusiastically, even when earlier records express uncertainty. Confidence replaces confusion retroactively. The story hardens, but the stone does not change. You feel a strange comfort in that. Stone remembers hands even when paper forgets them. As your breathing deepens, you imagine the low hum of bells across an older landscape, marking not ownership but rhythm. A civilization keeping time with itself, quietly, patiently. And as you drift onward, you carry the soft awareness that some of the tallest structures in early America were not declarations of arrival, but echoes of a system already ringing. You begin to listen more carefully now, not to what is built, but to what is spoken. The records thin, and in that thinning something fragile appears. Language. You notice it first in marginal notes. A word crossed out and replaced with something simpler. A phrase written phonetically, then corrected by another hand. Scripts copied without understanding, preserved like pressed flowers between pages. The writers admit, quietly, that they do not know how to pronounce certain words. They mention symbols seen on stones, tools and documents that do not belong to any alphabet they recognize. The symbols repeat across regions that are not supposed to be connected. This unsettles you in a gentle way. Languages usually fracture with distance. Dialects bloom, meanings drift, but here, something opposite seems to be happening. The same marks appear far apart, unchanged, as if they belong to a system that resisted local variation. You read of interpreters who struggle not because the language is complex, but because it does not behave like a spoken tongue at all. Some words seem positional, others appear ceremonial, used only in specific contexts. A few have no clear sound attached to them, only gesture, placement, or symbol. What kind of civilization designs language this way? You sense that you are brushing against something taboo now, though no alarm sounds. A language meant not for storytelling, but for instruction, for coordination, for maintaining systems rather than expressing identity. You think again of Tartaria, often described not through literature, but through administration, maps, records, measurements. A culture where meaning lives in function rather than flourish. If such a language existed, it would be difficult to inherit. It would not translate easily, and when misunderstood, it would be abandoned quickly. You notice how often these unknown words are replaced with familiar ones in later documents. Titles become ranks, symbols become decorations, terms of coordination become personal names or place labels. Meaning dissolves into shape. You feel the lull deepen, as if the story itself is growing quieter out of respect. Some settlers write that certain words are not meant to be spoken lightly. Others note that locals refuse to repeat them at all. Silence becomes part of the language's afterlife. And then, just like that, the references stop. Later records do not mention strange scripts. They do not admit confusion. Everything is suddenly named, categorized, and explained. The awkwardness is gone. You realize that this is not because understanding improved, but because curiosity ended. You feel a soft sadness, but it is distant, like a memory that does not belong to you personally. Languages do not die when no one speaks them. They die when no one needs them anymore. As your breathing slows, you imagine a time when words were tools, not identities. When symbols held instructions rather than stories. When language itself was infrastructure. And as you drift onward, heavy and calm, you carry the quiet realization that losing such a language would not feel like tragedy. It would feel like convenience. The records grow uneasy here, though they never admit it outright. The language softens, stretches, and begins to circle around something it does not wish to touch directly. Weather appears more often now. Seasons behave strangely. The land seems to hesitate. You read of years that do not act like years should. Long winters that arrive without warning. Summers that never fully warm. Rains that do not stop, soaking the ground until towns sink into mud and memory. The writers describe streets disappearing, buildings half-buried, lower floors abandoned and forgotten. They speak of it as inconvenience, not catastrophe, but you feel the weight beneath their calm. Some journals mention that entire settlements were reset higher up, as if it were the most reasonable thing in the world. New entrances cut above old doors, windows sealed and written off, basements quietly erased from use. Why build down into earth that you know will rise against you? You notice a word appear occasionally, then vanish again. Mud. Always mud. Thick, heavy, relentless. Not the playful mud of rainstorms, but something deeper, older, as if the land itself had loosened and decided to shift. The records never call it a flood, they never describe panic, they simply note the aftermath as though the event itself were too familiar to dramatize. You begin to sense a reset, not just of land, but of narrative. Older structures, those refined stone buildings, the towers, the foundations, are often described as partially buried by this time, their lower levels inaccessible, their origins already obscure. New construction rises atop them, lighter, simpler, temporary by comparison. You feel a gentle unease ripple through your thoughts. If Tartarian systems once existed here, roads, mounds, trade networks, then such a disruption would not need to destroy them completely. It would only need to bury enough to break continuity. You read of abandoned maps deemed no longer accurate, of boundaries redrawn not because land changed ownership, but because it changed shape. Rivers shift, coastlines blur, familiar landmarks sink or slide, the land becomes unreliable. You notice how quickly explanation fills the gap. Natural cycles, harsh climates, frontier hardship. All true perhaps, but incomplete. What if something larger passed through? Something that did not announce itself with fire or noise, but with pressure and weight. A quiet force that presses civilization downward and invites something simpler to grow on top. You're not told this directly. The records would never allow it, but they let you feel it. After this period, the tone of documentation changes. There is less reference to ancient works, less mention of unknown builders. The land feels newer now, not because it is, but because its past has been physically lowered out of sight. You feel the lull deepen, mud muffles sound. Buried things do not argue. You imagine Tartaria not falling in war, but sinking beneath seasons no one could stop. Systems broken not by enemies, but by Earth itself shifting its balance. And as you drift onward, your breathing slow and even, you carry a quiet understanding. Sometimes history does not end. Sometimes it is simply covered, gently, until only the tops of its tallest ideas remain visible. You notice the language of the records change again, though the shift is subtle. The sentences become more careful, more legal. Words like agreement, boundary, and recognition appear with increasing frequency. You have reached the treaties. These documents are meant to clarify, to bring order. But as you read them slowly, something feels strangely misaligned. The tone assumes authority on all sides. The phrasing suggests negotiations not just with tribes, not just with foreign crowns, but with something else. Something unnamed, yet acknowledged. Some treaties reference lands that no signatory fully controls. Others describe boundaries that follow older lines already present on maps. The language implies inheritance rather than conquest, as if the land is being transferred from one system to another, not seized from chaos. You notice phrases like formally administered, long recognized, and customary use. Customary to whom? Administered by what? The documents never say. You feel the same calm unease you felt before. Treaties are not written with ghosts. They are written when there is someone to recognize, even if their power is fading. Some agreements include clauses that make little sense in the context of tribal relations alone. Rules about trade continuity, passage rights across vast distances, protection of infrastructure that settlers did not build. Why protect what does not exist? You imagine Tartarian authority not as visible rulers, but as embedded systems. Roads, trade norms, timekeeping, land use. If such systems were still partially functioning, treaties would need to accommodate them, even if no one dared name their origin. You notice that as US expansion accelerates, treaties become more aggressive, more simplified. The earlier nuance disappears. Recognition gives way to assertion. Something has ended by then, the lull remains, but it carries a soft melancholy now. The documents feel like farewell letters written without acknowledging the departure. As you drift onward, you sense that treaties do not just end wars. Sometimes they quietly conclude eras. You do not notice the fire at first. It arrives softly, disguised as coincidence. An accident here, a misplaced candle there, a storage room overheated. The records mention these events with practiced calm, the way one mentions weather or illness. And yet, as you move slowly through the pages, a pattern begins to glow. Archives burn, courthouses collapse in flame, libraries vanish overnight. Collections described as extensive are reduced to ash with little lamentation. The writers sound resigned, almost relieved, as if something heavy has been lifted. You feel the quiet unease return. These are not random losses. The fires seem to favour certain things. Old maps, early records, documents labelled miscellaneous, unclassified, or of uncertain origin. The very materials that might have required explanation. You read a note stating that many earlier papers were regrettably destroyed, followed immediately by a declaration that the remaining records now present a clearer history. Clearer because it is simpler. Cleaner because it has fewer layers. You sense how erasure works best when it is framed as improvement. Some fires occur just before official reorganizations, counties are redefined, territories are renamed, new administrative systems roll out with fresh paperwork, unburdened by inconvenient precedents. You imagine clerks rebuilding shelves, copying what still fits, discarding what does not out of malice but efficiency. History trimmed to size, the lull deepens here because there is no villain to blame, no dramatic conspiracy written in smoke, just a series of reasonable decisions that collectively forget too much. You think of Tartarian traces, maps with too much detail, languages too strange, trade systems too smooth. How easily such things could be lost in a fire, and how difficult they would be to justify recreating. You notice how quickly replacement narratives settle in. New textbooks, new timelines, confident explanations written after the ashes cool. Memory is rebuilt, but thinner. As you drift onward, your breathing slow and even, you carry a soft realization. Sometimes history is not erased by force, but by tidying up. And what survives is not what is most true, but what is easiest to carry forward. You begin to see the lines now, even before the records mention them. They appear faintly at first, like threads pulled tight across the land. Surveyors arrive, instruments unfold, numbers replace names. The grid settles in, early descriptions of surveying feel almost ceremonial. Chains stretched carefully, angles measured again and again, points marked with quiet reverence. The land is no longer something you move through, it is something you divide. You read how surveyors often follow older lines without admitting it. They note that certain measurements align conveniently with existing paths, ridges, or boundaries. Convenient, as if coincidence itself has become polite. You recognize the pattern immediately. The grid does not overwrite everything. It absorbs what fits and ignores what does not. Old roads become section lines. Ancient boundaries become property edges. What cannot be squared is dismissed as irregular. You feel the lull deepen as the land becomes abstract. The surveyors speak of efficiency, clarity, fairness, equal parcels, straight lines, predictable ownership. These are not cruel ideas, they are calming ones. The grid promises order. But order always comes at a price. You notice how mounds are described now, not as mysteries but as obstructions. Roads are redirected. Earthworks flattened. The land is made compliant. History is pressed flat beneath measurement. You think of Tartarian systems again, fluid, networked, relational, a world measured by connection rather than possession. The grid does not understand such thinking. It demands edges, corners, ends. You feel a gentle sadness, but also inevitability. The grid is not malicious, it is simply final. Once the land is measured, it can be sold. Once it is sold, it can be forgotten. Ownership replaces memory. Deeds replace stories. The records grow confident now. Fewer questions, fewer hesitations. The past has been boxed into sections small enough to ignore. As you drift onward, heavy and calm, you carry the quiet understanding that the grid is not just a tool, it is a spell. And once cast, it is very hard to break. You feel the pace change now, though no one announces it. The records grow thicker, faster, louder. Iron appears, steam timetables. The rail dreamers arrive like a held breath finally released. Tracks cut across the land with urgency, following corridors that feel strangely familiar. You recognize them immediately, even if the documents do not say it outright. The rails often follow the old roads, the straight ones, the giant ones, the ones no one ever claimed to have built. Steel settles where stone once guided. You read glowing reports of progress, how the continent is being opened, how distance is being conquered. And yet beneath the celebration you sense something quietly closing. Railroads do not just connect, they decide. They choose winners and forgotten places, Towns bloom or die based on whether the track bends toward them. Old routes that once mattered fade overnight, no longer useful to the new rhythm. You notice how quickly the language shifts. Ancient becomes obsolete. Old becomes inefficient. What once felt mysterious now feels inconvenient. The lull remains, but it carries tension now, like a story nearing its end. You read that rail construction crews often uncover foundations, tunnels, and buried stonework. The reports mention delays, adjustments, unexpected obstacles. Then the track moves on and the obstacles are sealed beneath gravel and ties. Covered, but not removed. You imagine Tartarian systems finally losing their last usefulness here. Roads too wide, mounds too curved, trade networks too subtle. The new world wants speed, not balance. Extraction, not coordination. You feel the gate closing. After the rail spread, references to older anomalies vanish almost entirely. The land feels fully claimed now, fully named, fully explained. What remains unexplained is no longer recorded. You realize that this is not suppression. It is distraction. The future arrives loudly enough that the past cannot be heard. As your breathing slows again, you carry a soft understanding. Railroads did not just unite America. They sealed it. They locked the story into a forward-only motion, leaving anything that did not fit quietly behind. You think the story has ended, but it hasn't. It only pauses, gathers itself, and reappears dressed in celebration. The records brighten suddenly. Posters, invitations, grand announcements. World fairs rise from the pages like dreams made solid. You are told these are moments of arrival, proof that the nation has matured, that it can now display its genius to the world. And yet, as you drift through descriptions of these fairs, something feels familiar in a way that should not be possible. Buildings appear almost overnight. Vast halls, domes, colonnades, towers crowned with ornament and symmetry. They are described as temporary, yet built with a confidence that feels anything but fleeting. Stone-like facades, perfect proportions, styles that echo old-world grandeur without explanation. You feel the same calm shock you felt when reading about forts and towers earlier. How does a young nation summon such architecture so effortlessly? The official explanation is enthusiasm, ingenuity, plaster and wood made to look like marble, and perhaps that is true in part, but you notice how often visitors remark that the buildings feel ancient, solid, and strangely familiar, as if they have been seen before somewhere deeper in memory. You realize that these fairs are not just exhibitions, they are rehearsals of identity. The architecture borrows heavily from classical forms, arches, columns, symmetry that speaks of balance and permanence. You recognize the pattern now. This is the same language spoken by earlier stonework, earlier towers, earlier foundations. Borrowed or remembered. You notice something else. After the fairs close, many of these structures are destroyed, dismantled, or simply vanish from the narrative. Few remain, fewer are explained. It feels like a dream that dissolves upon waking. Why build something so grand only to erase it? You imagine the fairs as a final echo of Tartarian aesthetic, a style not fully understood but still admired. A moment when the land briefly reveals what it once knew how to host. The lull deepens here, soft and reflective. Celebration becomes nostalgia before anyone admits it. You sense that these fairs are not about the future at all. They are about reclaiming a past without naming it, displaying inherited beauty while denying inheritance itself. As you drift onward, you carry the quiet awareness that sometimes civilizations do not discover greatness. They redisplay it, briefly, before packing it away again. You feel the weight of everything you have gathered begin to settle now, not as confusion, not as fear, but as a single, slow-forming question. It rises naturally from the land, from the records, from the quiet spaces between words. Who are you meant to forget? You do not ask this angrily. You ask it the way one asks a question just before sleep, when answers are less important than honesty. The evidence has already passed before you like a long procession. Roads without builders, mounds without makers, maps without origins, trade without owners, towers without architects. None of it shouted, none of it demanded belief. It simply existed. You notice how carefully the records avoid naming a predecessor. They are comfortable admitting mystery, but not continuity. They prefer the idea of emptiness over the discomfort of inheritance. Because inheritance carries responsibility. If someone came before, then something was lost. and loss implies failure, not triumph. You think again of Tartaria, not as a banner or capital city, but as a way of being in the world. A civilization defined less by borders and more by alignment. Land aligned with sky, movement aligned with season, structure aligned with purpose rather than display. Such a civilization would not leave behind dramatic ruins, it would leave behind usefulness, and usefulness is easily mistaken for nature. You realize now why the records never argue. There is nothing to argue against. The past is not claiming ownership, it is not asking to be restored, it is simply there. The land behaves as though it remembers something older than nations. Rivers follow routes that feel chosen. Valleys cradle settlements as if anticipating them. High places call for towers, whether or not anyone knows why. You feel the question deepen, not sharpen. What if early America was not founded on wilderness, but on amnesia? Not a malicious forgetting, a practical one. The kind that happens when a new story needs room to speak. When complexity feels burdensome, when speed replaces patience. You sense that the forgetting was gradual, almost gentle, no single decision, no single authority, just layer after layer of simplification, rename, rebuild, repurpose, until the original context dissolves, and yet traces remain, always. Why do certain places feel older than their dates? Why do some towns feel settled before they were settled? Why does the land sometimes feel like it is waiting rather than being discovered? These are not questions meant for debate. They are questions meant for quiet companionship. You imagine Tartaria not as an empire defeated, but as a caretaker stepping aside. Its systems too subtle for a louder age. Its methods too slow for a world obsessed with acceleration. Perhaps it did not fall. Perhaps it was absorbed, diluted, forgotten by design and convenience rather than force. You feel a strange comfort in that thought. There is dignity in quiet endings. The question lingers again. Who were you meant to forget? Not just names, not just builders, but a way of relating to the world, a way of moving without conquering, of building without branding, of coordinating without announcing. You realize that remembering does not require belief. It requires attention, and attention is slow. As your breathing becomes deeper, you sense that this question does not demand resolution tonight. It is enough to let it rest beside you, like a closed book placed gently on a table. Some truths are not meant to wake you. They are meant to accompany you into sleep. And as the land grows quiet again in your mind, you feel the question soften, becoming less an accusation and more an invitation. To notice what still stands, what still guides, what still whispers beneath the story you were taught. You return now slowly to where you began, but you are not the same traveller. The records lie open behind you like a long road, seen from a hill at dusk. You no longer rush to connect them, you let them rest. What you feel now is not urgency, but hush. The land, as it appears in these early American pages, no longer feels empty or chaotic, it feels layered, like a place that has worn many names without ever needing one. Flags rise and fall above it, but fierce ground itself remains calm, patient, unconcerned. You sense how the final transformation takes place, not through fire, not through conquest, but through certainty. Once the story becomes confident enough, it no longer needs to explain. The records stop hesitating, they stop admitting mystery. Everything is now claimed, measured, and placed in order. The lull is complete. Tartaria, if it ever existed here, is no longer spoken of, not because it was disproven, but because it is no longer useful to mention. Systems that once coordinated land and sky are replaced with systems that coordinate profit and speed. Roads become rails, bells become clocks, memory becomes archive, and yet nothing truly disappears. You feel this most strongly in the quiet moments, when a town seems older than its founding date, when a road feels purposeful beyond traffic, when a hill feels watched rather than climbed. These sensations are not evidence, they are echoes. You realize that forgetting does not erase a civilization's influence. It only changes how it is felt. The lullaby quality of this realization settles over you now. There is no anger here, no demand for restoration, just acceptance. Civilizations, like people, do not always die loudly. Some dissolve into the background, becoming the stage rather than the actors. You imagine Tartaria as such a presence, no longer visible, no longer named, but still shaping choices, alignments, and instincts beneath the surface of the newer world. And perhaps that is why the story feels so calm. Nothing is being stolen from you tonight. No belief is being forced upon you. You're only being invited to notice that history is deeper than its timelines and land is wiser than its labels. As the records close, gently one by one, the noise of explanation fades. What remains is a soft awareness that the world you inhabit may be older, more intentional, and more mysterious than you were taught, but not in a frightening way, in a comforting one. Now, you let the pace slow even further. The questions no longer press. They stretch out, soften, and lose their sharp edges. You do not need answers to sleep peacefully. You only need the feeling that something makes sense in a way that words cannot quite reach. Imagine the land settling beneath a blanket of stars, roads resting, stones cooling, rivers continuing without commentary. Whatever once moved across this continent, Tartarian or otherwise, has finished its work for the night. You are safe here, held not by certainty, but by continuity. History fades into something gentler now, like breath becoming slower as sleep arrives. The old systems do not demand remembrance. They are content to remain woven into the world itself, doing what they have always done, supporting, guiding, and waiting. And as your eyes grow heavy, you can let the final thought drift through you without effort. Nothing important is truly lost. Some things simply learn how to be quiet. End of script. Sweet dreams.